Hello, everybody. Welcome to Archives and Copyright, a beginner's guide. I feel like this title might be a slight misnomer because this is less of a lesson and more of a discussion. And I really would like you to participate and to think of some questions. We're going to leave quite a lot of time at the end because I'm sure many of you have queries from the general to the specific. So do take advantage of the experts that we have on our panel today. We have a range of people from legal expertise through to production, through to two very well-respected archives in the UK. So without further ado, I will just briefly introduce our panelists. On the far right, we have Amanda Huntley, who is director of Huntley Film Archives, a commercial film archive specializing mainly in documentary footage and entirely film-based. Is that correct?
Not entirely anymore. I think that was the case perhaps even 10 years ago, but we've certainly got plenty of tapes.
Yeah. To my immediate right, I have Simon McCallum, who is a curator of the BFI Mediatheque. That is the public-facing section of the BFI National Archive. You will get to hear from these people directly shortly. To my left, I have Tony Morris, who is a lawyer from Marriott Harrison, who also works with Paul Bell on my far left, archive producer, whose films you may have seen. They include the excellent Amy and Senna, and Life in a Day, which I just found out.
Life in a Day, yeah. What else, mate? The Age of Stupid, perhaps, that kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
A few films.
Yeah, just a few films that you might have heard of, you know. The aim of this session is to introduce you to some of the complexities of UK copyright law, and also to introduce those of you who might not be familiar with archives to the range of archives that exist. I think some people have an image of what an archive is, and we want to explore and explode that a little bit. I have a couple of plugs to make. The first one is Tony's book. We'll get this out of the way now. So Tony has written an excellent and comprehensive guide to legal issues for filmmakers. So filmmakers in the room looking to work with archive or copyrighted material.
I recommend it, actually.
Yeah. And the second plug is for a free online course which launches on Monday, which was supported by Creative Skillset and BAFTA. It's called Unlocking Film Rights, and it's an introduction to copyright relating to film and moving image in the UK. And if you look online at the session description of this session, you can find the link, register. It starts on Monday. It's completely free. It's about 2 hours long in total. And I think there's some people in the room that have done it. I've had good feedback from them, so maybe check with them if you want to know more. Final thing before we get going is I'd like to just do a scan of the audience and find out the makeup of who's in the room. So I know that we have some archivists or wannabe archivists or young archivists to be, so if you guys would like to give us a wave, that would be great. Many of you. Yeah, and filmmakers. Hello, filmmakers. And I have a final question for the filmmakers, which is, do any of you have archive strategies in place for your work? Have you donated any of your work to an archive? Have you even thought about what you're doing with your films once you've made them? No. One. Excellent. Well, yeah, so that guy gets the brownie points. To kick us off, I think I'm just going to hand over to Tony and ask you if you could very quickly introduce us to what copyright actually is. It's something that there's some confusion about. So can you give us a one-line?
1.5. I'm a lawyer. I'll negotiate.
Yeah.
Right. Good afternoon. A copyright is a property right. In English law, it arises as a matter of law in any original literary, dramatic, musical, or artistic work. And for those purposes, a computer program is considered a literary work. So copyright arises in those original works. The first owner of a copyright is the author, the person who created the copyright, and that will be the individual writer, artist, author, etc., unless the work is created in the course of full-time employment. So a journalist working for a magazine who writes a story and he's employed full-time, the owner of the copyright will be the magazine. Is that short enough?
Yeah, that's
Anything
short
else?
enough.
I can elaborate a little bit more if you want.
I would want to make the simplification that it's not a given if you're employed by somebody. You still need a contract saying that you've assigned those rights.
Right, this is I didn't think you wanted to get into this. The most common mistake that we get to deal with in the office, probably on at least a once-a-week basis, is where one person asks another to create copyright work and even pays for it. The commissioning party, the person who's asking for the creation of the work, does not own the copyright unless there is a written transfer of ownership from the person that has been commissioned to create the copyright. So if you hire a photographer to take stills for your film, and you pay that photographer so many, £100 to produce 10 stills, you do not own the copyright in those works unless you are able to persuade the photographer to transfer, or what we call assign ownership of the copyright. If you do not have a written transfer or assignment of that copyright, all you will have is a license, a right to use the photograph, and that license will be limited to the purposes that were in the reasonable contemplation of the parties at the time of the commission. So if you say, I am making this film for a student film festival, please take the stills, you don't get an assignment or transfer of ownership, you cannot then use those stills for a purpose other than that film festival without going back to the photographer for another permission, which may, of course, cost you more money.
Has everybody got that? Oh, great. Okay. I think, it's simple. There's another way of putting it, not to rain on your parade, Tony, which is the main thing to remember with copyright is that it's an inherent right. So it literally is the right to copy a work, and you don't need to apply to have that right. It's inherent in the creation of the work itself. So there's some confusion sometimes between the UK and the US, where you register copyright in certain circumstances in the US. In the UK, and as a general principle, copyright is not something that you have to apply for. If you took the photograph, you own the copyright, and you own that until such time that you transfer the right to somebody else. Are we good?
We're good.
Yeah, good. So if it's so simple, why is it so complicated? I think that's what we're trying to discover here today. So this session is going to look at various applications of creative works, and I think we should start looking at some of the history of copyright and the fact that the law originally has been based on format, and then as technology has advanced, formats have changed, and this is where we start to get into quite complicated territory. So again, I'm going to go back to Tony for some précis of where we've got to with film. Is that okay?
Wow. As I wasn't prepared for this.
Oh.
Are you actually asking what are the copyrights in a film and how they're protected, or?
No, I'm trying to get to the idea. If we have an inherent work,
Right.
An inherent right within a work, why is it so complicated to?
Well, the problem with film specifically, and if I'm not answering your question, please interrupt me. A film is a collection of lots and lots of different copyrights. There'll be the script, the director has a copyright. Once you get into documentaries or even features where you're using other people's material, archives, which these good folk will tell you about, there will be footage, there will be stills, there will be text, there will be literary works, music. All of these individual copyright items have a provenance, and in order to use them, you need to make sure that you have the right. Now, there are certain exceptions to the right that was explained just now, whereby you can use certain works in certain contexts for fair use. And maybe we'll get on to that later. Yeah. But the complexity,
let's not go there right now.
The complexity simply is that when you look at a bit of film on the screen, as a producer, in order to get there, you need to make sure that every little component part of that film, you have the right to use it in your film. Is that the question you were asking?
It wasn't, but it was a good précis of film production and why you need to do your due diligence. I was trying to get to some of the complications that we get to with archive material and who it belongs to and expiry dates. But we can go there later in the session.
Okay, give someone else a chance.
I feel like I've put you on the spot enough. So.
No, I can answer the question. But,
yeah. As we're discovering, copyright is a very simple principle and immediately gets quite complicated as soon as you start to explode it. I'm going to move on to the second part of our session, which is starting to look at archive. And I'm just going to start with giving you guys a chance to tell us a little bit about what you do with your particular archives and show some visual material to illustrate.
Would you like to me?
Yeah.
Do I go? Okay, I'll go. Hello. So I'm Amanda. I'm from Huntley Film Archives. So my collections are entirely vintage. By that I mean historic. So the footage that I hold within my collections is not being generated now and probably wasn't even generated last year. It tends to be 10, 20, 30 years old. I started 1895 at the very inception of the invention of cinema, and I go up to about the 1980s before I start petering out. That has been our collection since we started. My collection started, I think we're in our 32nd year now, and we have always been out of date. And by out of date, I mean we tend to pick up film material when others have lost interest in it. And that tends to be at the end of its commercial life. So a film is obviously commissioned and goes through the production process and then is marketed and sold. And there comes a point in its life where it is not making any more money for the filmmakers. And at that point, the film normally arrives with me. So I get large collections from retired filmmakers who no longer can put in the 14 hours a day, 7 days a week to produce their films, and have now stopped working. And what they depend upon to keep them going is royalties from their back catalogue, the films that they've made up till that point. So I'm always dealing with retrospective law. When I'm looking at copyright, I'm always examining the transitions that have happened in copyright law since the inception of cinema in 1895. And there's a few key dates, like 1912, 1951, another change of law when we became part of the EU. Goodness knows what will happen when we're not anymore. So I'm interested in those key dates around how copyright has changed. In a nutshell, if you asked me to sort of summarize briefly, I would say take advice from your archive. We're the guys that know. I have about 100,000 films in my collection, say, and frankly, the copyright changes from film to film. So I need to keep on top of not only the changes in copyright, because copyright is not a static thing. It's endlessly on the move. It's always changing. I mean, take, for example, I think you've got them with you, Simon, the Ealing comedies. Everybody knows what the Ealing comedies were. There was 1 year back in the 1990s where those films changed hands 5 times in 1 year. The copyright shifted 5 times in 1 year as the ownership shifted. So keeping on top of that kind of information is really the hard work. And my simple message would be is if you're acquiring archive from an archive like mine or Simon's, then take their advice. Listen to what they say. If you ask the question, they'll normally give you the advice as to what kind of rights you need to be keeping your eye out for and what clearances are required.
And don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah, I think so. But don't you, Simon? I think so. I think sometimes we're loath to tell you guys what your job is. I've never made a film in my life. It's not my job. I'm not a filmmaker. I see my job as being to collect and to preserve and make accessible when you need them. That's my job. That's what I'm trying to do. But to make that accessible means to try and have everything is in good order as I possibly can for when you need it for your film. So we're quite intimately acquainted with each title we have within our collection. And yeah, definitely, ask us as many questions as you need to make sure that you're the right side of the law.
And although this sounds off-putting in some senses, don't be dissuaded from using archive in your project. You know, as we've all said, please do approach us. And although it has to be dealt with tends to be a sort of case-by-case basis, as Amanda said, it's not as scary as it sounds, you know. We can deal with most of the situations that come up, so.
And if we can't, we'll find you an alternative.
We will.
I think that's the other thing, wouldn't you agree? That the best kind of filmmakers to work with are the ones that retain a certain amount of flexibility.
Sure.
And if the copyright precludes you using the clip you've set your heart on, be flexible enough to say, well, look, we could offer this as an alternative.
I think that's a good time to actually segue over to Paul and just ask a more general question, which is why do you choose to work with archive material when many filmmakers choose to create anew or to reenact? What do you find is the pull?
I mean, for me, I mean, I think about the two well-known films really recently of Senna and Amy. The power of archive film is that it's real in a way that other film isn't, and it brings kind of an authenticity into it. Especially when you start dealing with subjects like when someone's dead, you can't. It's sadly we all know how the story of Amy Winehouse ends. If I was making a film about Amy, I'd really want to go and interview her, but I can't. The only recourse I've got for that is with archive material. And then as we kind of discover, as archive filmmaking has become more and more sophisticated, I think it's kind of fair to say that we're discovering there's more power in it, really, than there. When I first started out in this industry, in kind of TV and film in general, I was kind of working as a general researcher in some ways and was always working with archive, although weirdly, previously I had actually run a film library before I started working in film production. So I do kind of understand the industry from both sides. I would often, this is kind of thinking like 10, 15 years ago, be saying to a director I was working with, well, I've actually got this archive of this person that you're about to interview or you're making a film about from however many years ago. Producers, directors, they like having cameras in their hands and they want to go and interview people. They want to think, and quite rightly at times, because they want to get something new. But at the same time, I often think the closer you can get your material from when the event happened or whatever it is, the film that you're making, archive also gives you something which you're not going to get because it's filmed by someone else. It's going to be through someone else's lens. It's going to be very powerful because of that. If you just think of a film like Amy, there are some really quite disturbing sequences where she's being assailed from like 4 or 5 different angles all at the same time. And with archive material in general, we're able to show that.
Yeah.
And to give you, hopefully, a sense of what it's like to be under the gaze of all those lenses. So, archive, like any type of filmmaking, is really about how are you using it and how you're going to contextualize it. But for me, I'm fascinated by archive because, one, there's so much of it. And on a really...
More and more every day.
More and more every day. But on a really simple level from a producer, if I'm going along pitching an idea, if it's an archive idea, I know the film already exists, or I hope it exists, or I think I know a way of actually getting hold of it. If you're, by definition, archive has an element of being historical, which means you can generally pitch the end of your film as well.
Yeah.
So there's some really basic things like that which make archive practical as a filmmaker. To me as well, once you start getting into it and you start understanding how copyrights work, and you begin to realize that actually everything that you see in an archive film is owned by someone else, and get your head round, okay, I've just got to deal with that, then you actually find a freedom in it. You find a freedom that actually I can use all this material without having to, how am I going to do all this on my own? So yeah, I mean,
That's quite a lovely view, actually, that you're unlocking stories that already exist out in the world.
To me, I mean, if you take, these kind of these old movie making tropes of that every story's already been made and all that, it's all there. It really is.
Yeah.
It's in the archive somewhere, and it's also very relevant to to where we are today. I mean, so So when we mentioned Life in a Day, I mean, does that even classify as as an archive film? Because we were asking people to sit down on the 24th of July 2012 and film their day. So I was commissioning archive by doing that. And if you take the view that everything now is archive, the panel I was on yesterday is already archive, and hopefully some filmmaker might use it. They might not. It's that kind of thing. So
we're being recorded.
And it really is. It's like archive for me, and my romantic view of it is really understanding how the world records itself.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'm going to jump back to Amanda and ask you not quite the same question, but what is it about archive that drew you to the work that you do?
Well, I think, as I said, I really do not see myself as part of the creative process at all. I'm a librarian when it comes down to it. I like stuff orderly on the shelf that I can find it when I need to. And I think those instincts means that I get a great deal of joy out of seeing my archive used creatively. I mean, there's nothing so more wonderful than being able to work collaboratively in collaboration with filmmakers and produce something where the archive is used really sensitively and really historically appropriately. And I suppose on the other end of the scale, exactly as everybody's been saying about archive is what was shot yesterday, if not an hour ago, I would say that all filmmakers should strive to put a copy of their film into an archive. It doesn't have to be mine, ideally mine, but if it's not mine, any archive, because in some ways you guys depend on us for your immortality. Think of it that way, because that's how you examine previous filmmakers. You go to the archives to see what's there. So if your work isn't in an archive, it's liable to get lost, and that's mine and Simon's job, to try and make sure that as much material as possible actually survives and makes it through. And the best way to make it through is to be in a proper archive, because we have the tools to be able to do that job. And I was interesting listening to Paul just now. There is a little bit of an assumption that everything is available to you within an archive, and that's really not so. I can't count the number of times I've been asked for really important personages and events which simply weren't recorded on film. I think probably one of my main ones would be Virginia Woolf. I mean, she died in 1939, so film had been around for 44 years and nobody thought to actually film the lady. There's somebody of such great magnitude. And there are dozens, if not hundreds of people in that bracket who are never... So making it through survival, your film making it through and surviving is not a given.
Don't assume someone else is looking after it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of assumptions made that, somebody's got it somewhere.
Yeah.
So do think these things through quite carefully and plan ahead. And we were talking about hard drives earlier, about the degradation of these kind of quite contemporary formats. They're degrading faster than nitrate film ever did. It's kind of funny to think that a lot of nitrate film we have at the BFI has survived in much better condition than VHS tapes from the 80s, or U-matics, or 1 inches, or even digital files that are sort of magically disappearing from the drives.
DCP got lost in the post.
Yeah, so we're in a real state of flux at the moment in terms of formats, which is another big issue we're all facing.
It is. And I think sort of even the archive world has been through something of a kind of crisis, really, because we all knew where we were in a celluloid world. if something came to you on 16mm, you printed it for preservation purposes on 16mm. Likewise, 35 or your 9.5s and your 8mm and all those gauges that exist out there. And then digital came along, and I adore digital for what it does in terms of access. Of course, it's been amazing. You know, I started with a card index, you know, and the getting and posting out VHSs to people, and that was the limit of access. But now access is such a simple and easy and accessible job. But the trouble is that it's not all about access. The access is the end of the job, isn't it, Simon? It's the beginning of the job is to make sure that those films exist. And we struggle with formats and the changing tape formats. And just as Simon says, in so many ways, preserving film has become the easy option. And it's the later gauges and formats that give us the trouble.
I feel like now might be a nice time to actually take a look at some archive material. So we have a very short clip from Huntley Film Archives that illustrates some of the content that they have.
And as I said, most of my collection is celluloid-based. And it's quite difficult for archivists also to make that leap of faith to embrace the preservation of new technologies. Do you find? I think I've sniffed too much celluloid. I'm a bit addicted now, and a hard drive just doesn't smell the same, does it? So it is difficult for archivists to be able to keep up. We're always a step behind. We're always being led. We rarely innovate. That's partly because my instinct is to make sure technology has been around long enough before I jump and embrace it. Do you find the same thing?
I mean, we are sort of making our best efforts to acquire born digital content and also get in there at an earlier stage. So at least with, you know, feature production where the BFI has some investment involved, we'll at least there try to make sure that copies are archived as soon as possible in the process, as well as kind of actively pursuing filmmakers who are working with digital formats to kind of acquire their work. But it's just such a mammoth field, everything being uploaded to YouTube, you know, people's phones. It's kind of mind-boggling, really.
We live in an age where everything is deliverable by phone, but how does that help 4K? It doesn't. And so we always have a bit of a disconnect between what you as filmmakers require and just making things accessible.
Well, there's a curation element to archives as well, which I think leads us nicely into some a segue into some of the work that you do, Simon, that is different to preserving and more about access.
Sure. I mean, I'm sort of coming at this very much from a programming or curation element. So I joined the BFI as part of our BFI Mediatheque project, where we've rolled out a network around the UK of 9 venue-based resources to really to start allowing broader public access to the BFI National Archive. We look after one of the biggest archives in the world. It's probably around 1 million film and TV titles. So my job as part of the curatorial teams is really to try and just wrangle with that, make some sense of that, and start to get some of it out there to the people that essentially own this, which is the public, as well as the Mediatheques, which I should say on the rights front, we had to negotiate with around, well, to date, at least 250 external rights holders, and this was to clear approximately 3,000 film and TV titles that are now available in Mediatheque. So you can see from that that's quite a high proportion of rights holders involved, where even though we're making this material available for free, which is a real benefit with Mediatheques, we have still had to make those endeavours to clear with the rights holders, because the BFI, although it holds the national collection, we don't own rights to much of what's in there. We can't just do what we want with it. So this is where I kind of crash into the whole copyright issue, and our rights team have worked very diligently to kind of clear this material. I've had some experience setting up our YouTube channel in 2007 and have sort of seen that develop into the kind of craziness that is YouTube today, and we're all competing for eyeballs on this archive. Competing for eyeballs. More recently, though, and what relates to the clip that we'll show you in a moment is mammoth digitisation project that the BFI is leading on at the moment, the centrepiece of which is a project called Britain on Film. So we're digitising 5,000 films from BFI and another 5,000 from our partner archives around the UK. The idea is that it sort of is gradually rolled out onto BFI Player, which is our relatively new VOD platform. And you can go to the map, BFI Player, I should know this. You can Google it, BFI Player. And the idea is it's very much about linking and connecting archive film to where you're from and giving people that chance to explore the map and find places that mean something to them. And we've been furiously geo-tagging as much as we can of this digitisation work. So that's again involved incredibly detailed rights work by our rights and contracts team to deal with hundreds of external rights holders, a mixture of licensing for free-to-view and pay-per-view content online, so slightly different to the Mediatheque project. But I think, is that a good time to move to the trailer?
Yeah,
so it's just a short 90-second trailer of Britain on Film that gives you a flavour of the type of material we've been working with and rolling out over 5 years.
So if anybody needed an argument for the power of archive, I think that we've just experienced it in the room. I know that I have a strong emotional connection immediately just to the range and the truth that's on offer. It's a beautiful project.
I should just also say that despite talking about these hundreds of external rights holders, I mean, the BFI does own or represent some collections where if you are interested, they can be licensed fairly straightforwardly. So the Mitchell and Kenyon collection, incredible collection of Edwardian film that was discovered in the 90s, the topical budget newsreel that ran to 1930, British transport film, so some of those gorgeous kind of colour travelogues from the 50s. We also represent some of the Crown copyright, the COI, that kind of material. So there is a sort of good tranche of material in the national collection where we can quite happily license it, but there's much more besides. And that's where this conversation kind of comes in, really.
I think it's worth making the point as well, and apologies to those of you who are archive literate, but that not every archive owns all of the material that it holds.
No, we own about 60% of ours that you can again license directly with us, and the rest of the collections that we have, you would have to clear the copyright elsewhere yourself as a filmmaker. If you wanted to access it from us, you would still have to go about clearing the extra rights. Tends to be kind of third-party stuff, but sometimes it can be the rights itself, depending. And more often, we're including the material that we own outright ourselves. We have also what we call an agency material. In other words, the films that belong to other filmmakers, like yourselves, but it's lodged with us, and then we license it on your behalf and do a profit share on that. So there are different models around the use of archive that can make the whole copyright straightforward, just as Simon suggests. And that's what I really meant when I said sometimes if you can be flexible in what you want, and one alternative is too expensive, too difficult, too awkward, too time-consuming to clear. If you have the ability to be flexible and look at alternative sources, that's where your archive will help you and say, well, this is going to take you 6 months to clear, and it's going to cost you, $100,000 to do it because it's some feature film from a Hollywood studio, and you want 5 minutes of it, or have you thought about trying it this way? We would never, ever interfere. Don't get me wrong. We would never interfere with your creative minds. That's not what we're there to do. We're not trying to write the story for you, but just offer more cost-effective ways out of your dilemma.
I think this is a good point to come back to Tony, actually. Do you find people are prepared for the level of expense that archive material can require? Is that something that you do? Is it a consultancy that you offer?
It's not really. We wouldn't really get into that. On documentaries, I usually get brought in for two things. One, to review them at the end for sort of general compliance with things like libel laws, and then we look at things and you say, have you cleared this copyright? And the classic situation, am I allowed one quick war story?
Oh,
Yeah.
the more war stories, the
Yeah,
better,
well,
please.
I'm allowed to use this because the producer said I could. About 8 or 10 years ago, some clients of mine produced a feature film called The Killing of John Lennon, which is a terrific movie, and it describes the 3 months in the life of Michael David Chapman, who was the murderer of John Lennon. It's a drama, and these two guys were moonlighting from the BBC and daytime jobs. They spent 2 years making this movie. And I did a little bit of basic work for them with the financiers, and they didn't have much of a legal budget. And they said to me, would you like to come along and see a screening of this film before we start taking it to the market? So I went along to a little screening room in Soho, and I sat there, and as always, I had my trusty pad and pen, because I can't go to a screening without one. And I sat there, and it's a terrific film, but there's a lot of third-party material in recordings, music, footage, trailers from movies like Raging Bull that were out at the time that Lennon was murdered, and television bits that are on the background and all the rest of it. And I started noting these down, and at the end of it, I said to them, so who's done your clearances? And they said, what clearances? I said, well, you've got Raging Bull, and you've got a poster from this, and this, that, and the other. And they suddenly went, they hadn't even thought about it because they just hadn't. It hadn't been a budget item, which is a very long-winded way of answering your question, is, had they considered this? No. And it would be, there are people that go out and do clearances. There are clearance companies. And I suggested that as much as I would enjoy trying to clear all this stuff, it would be far too time intensive. And they had to raise an extra chunk of cash, not only to clear the material they wanted to clear, but also to hire someone who knew how to do it.
Yeah.
You raise a couple of good points there, Tony, because it does astound me how often people come to me saying that they've got an archive-based project. So maybe they're expecting it to be 80% archive, and they've got no budget for archive. And you think, well, but it happens over and over again. And I don't know how that happens, but it's quite common.
I mean, from my point of view in this industry, it's like, yeah, I've often worked in, you work in jobs where people are making a documentary or any type of program. I mean, it's not just documentaries that use archive, it can be, location. It could be, it's like, and there's kind of a presumption by some people, it's like, oh, we'll just put a bit of archive in there. Yeah. And it's normally, they often think photographs, and they think, just one photograph can cost you £2,000. So it's often because the people themselves who are making it have no real kind of sense of what archive is. They think kind of see it as a filler. Even if you go the other way around, so you work with people that I work with who are very experienced with archive and understand it, they're still genuinely surprised at times how much something is going to cost. I mean, I always kind of work off the principle with negotiation, things like that, because part of what I do as an archive producer is that I will budget films. I will work out, if you come to me and say, you want to make an archive-based film, I can pretty much work out in terms of what archive you think you're going to use, how you're going to use it, and also work out how much you're probably going to need, not just in time to find all this material and access it and do it all, but actually to pay for it. In terms of, as a good rule of thumb for people out there, if you're looking at an archive feature documentary and you're looking to clear for all world, all media in perpetuity, if you're trying to get away with paying less than £3,000 per minute aggregate across your film, you need to think again.
I agree with that. I think your sums are spot on.
Yeah, I mean, there will always be some things. I mean, when we get to show the clip, which I brought along from Amy, and we'll start talking about all the individual copyrights which are involved in there, and then you start to begin, because some things won't cost you a thing. That's one of the wonders about making a film when you've actually got a film about someone, and because you often find, if I was making a film about John Lennon and I was making it with Yoko Ono, I would hope that I'd actually get some archive which would be free. You never know. But then
Not
that's
from
the thing.
Yoko, you wouldn't.
There you go. You would know more
I'll
about it. But
second
then,
that.
yeah. So it's, it is the thing that everything, with archive, not to put you off of it, is that, but it is no different than anything else. If you're paying to go and film in Japan, you think of the cost involved in doing that. You've got to pay for everything that you do. The assumption that archive is going to be a cheap option is wrong. It's an equitable option to me. To me, it aggregates itself out. It's normally about the same cost. In the films.
I'd say for me, for my archive, it's probably our single biggest challenge, is to make people understand that they do actually have to pay for it at all.
Yeah.
And even last night, somebody said to me, and I won't name names, but surely, how hard is it? Just dump it down on a hard drive and send it to me. And you mean I've got to pay for that? And it's very, very difficult for us as archives. We struggle, I think, in the terms of kind of PR for ourselves, really, in explaining to people why that's not the case. I think the assumption is it's just sitting on a shelf.
I mean, I do think that some people think that. I often have discussions with some producers and directors and like, well, hold on, I just want everything. Go and get everything for me. And that because it's known as an archive, then somehow there's some kind of public availability to it.
Yeah.
And then I turn around and point out to them, well, hold on, what about all your rushes? Their archive? Are you just going to let someone else in and use them regardless? So it's, which does come back to my thing of everything is archive. It's that, you are creating your own archive every time you create a film. So you then have to start thinking about, how am I going to curate this? How am I going to keep this? Picking up on hard drives, it's every time I get a chance to speak to people, it's remind them, any of your hard drives out there, you may have had them a few years. If you haven't turned it on in the last 12 months, you really should go and turn it on. It's like a car battery. If you don't turn it on, it might not work. So you need to think about that.
And the impetus, of course, that you might think that there's no value in the work now, but there may be down the line.
As an example, say, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the film Senna, but it begins with this really lovely kind of Super 8 film. And the first time, there's one of the first bits of film I saw during the actual research process of the film. And the guy who was showing it to me was like, oh, you won't be interested in this. And wanting to skip forward it and not wanting, it's like, as an archive filmmaker, there's that classic moment in lots of documentaries. I'm thinking of, whenever I watch a BBC Horizon show, there's always a long shot of a car wing mirror as you're driving somewhere and a man talking over the top about the Hadron Collider or something like that. You need walking shots. We need boring material. We need a shot of Senna walking along, a tracking shot. All of that, what you wouldn't consider to be archive, I will consider it to be archive and to be usable in terms of making a film out of it. Yeah. And again, I mean, when I used to run a film library, it was that kind of thing. It's like I would see that there was value in that material, but it takes time and money and a love of being a librarian to keep stuff like that.
It might have to sit on the shelf
for
decades.
You may sell it just the once.
Anybody appreciates it, and as you say, might sell it once.
Well,
but it means that there could be decades of
exactly, yeah.
But it's decades of overhead and people cataloguing it and
Yeah.
keeping it in a
And
temperature-controlled
preservation
environment and turning on the hard drive every year to make sure it doesn't disappear.
But then it becomes that thing that everyone talks about, unseen archive. It's not unseen.
It's
It was never
unrecognised.
unseen.
I
It's
prefer
never
the
been
term
unseen.
unrecognised because unseen. To be seen, it needs a director to make it into a creative work and then let it be seen. But it doesn't mean it's unrecognised. It means that we all know about it as archivists, but we're not filmmakers. You guys are.
It's what we always have from journalists with press stories when we're trying to kind of promote the collections we're launching online and elsewhere is has anyone seen this before? Is this is this an exclusive?
The guy who shot it, the guy who edited it, the guy who,
The
unless they were all
archivist that
blind
catalogued it.
and deaf and dumb.
The expectations in the sort of press sometimes are quite astounding.
But sometimes they need that story, don't they?
Yeah.
They think it makes it sound exciting.
Got to be an angle.
Yeah.
Well, no, it does. I mean, I often get called an archive guru and an archive wizard at one time I was called, because I find things, I find gold, apparently. So it's not. I mean, there is a way, having research skills is a very important thing, and I hope all the people who are learning the research skills here, it's like, because you need them in general to make films, not just to deal with archive. You know, if you make a science film and you're a science researcher, that doesn't mean to me you couldn't go and make a film about anything else. If you've got research skills, those are very important things.
I'm really conscious that we're actually running out of time, and we haven't taken a look at Amy yet. So can we have a look and then talk about some of the practical
scene, the scene will kind of speak for itself.
I feel like we should have a little bit of audience interaction here, possibly ask some questions.
Well, just to preface that everything there was cleared. Everything, the amount of copyrights that are going on in that short clip is about 2.5 minutes.
Well, shall we do a straw poll of how many?
Name the copyrights then. What do you, if you come
think?
here as a beginner's guide, what do you think was copyright in that clip?
I made it about 10.
Oh, a lot more.
Way more than that.
Yeah.
Shall we
Way
do
more.
show of hands? Shall we do who thinks it was 1 to 10? You all know it wasn't. Who thinks it was 10 to 20?
Oh, I don't know the exact number, but
Do
I
you
can
not
guess.
Who thinks it was more than 20?
Yeah, definitely.
Did it go to more than 50?
I can't really remember. If you think of, because there are also other rights, I mean, Amy is a film made to go into the cinema, made to be sold internationally. So we're getting out of the realm also of UK copyright. We're getting into creating a chain of title. So if you don't know what a chain of title is, at the end of your movie, any film you've made, you have to deliver this chain of title, which proves where everything comes from. And so a film like Amy gets distributed and shown on cinemas around the world, which means the distributors who are buying this film to show, they don't see it as any different to the next Spider-Man movie in terms of everything that appears in that Spider-Man movie is owned by the production company. There's, they put everything there. If there's a Coca-Cola can there, it's there for a reason. When you come to dealing with documentary, especially when you're trying to make feature documentaries, you're going to have to deal with those expectations as well, that people will expect you to have cleared everything, and there is no way you're going to be able to. We don't have a clip of it, but if you've seen Senna, you'll realize that there's probably quite a lot of advertising in that film, just even on the man's chest himself. Right at the beginning of that film, we sat down with the lawyers from Working Title Films, who are part of Universal Pictures, and someone in the room, a lawyer, said, "So who's going to clear all the advertising then?" And I kind of stood up in front of all of the execs at Working Title, the directors, like, well, we may as well forget this project now then, because there was no way that was ever going to happen. And then they went, okay, we'll take a view on that. Taking a view means that they're never going to clear it. So they didn't, it's...
I think they call it risk assessment.
Well, everything, I mean, in archive, everything is a risk assessment, because it is a grey area. Because if you think of, so just thinking about that clip, it begins with a drone shot of Washington Square. And you have some music from the local radio playing over the top. So just importantly is not just the visuals, it's the audio that's going on as well. I've been in touch with the radio show. They were more than happy to have their station jingle played in a film that was being shown worldwide. The drone shot itself, again, that's archive. We didn't commission that. I found that on YouTube. And it kind of fitted perfectly with what we wanted to do, to going up in the air, into the radio waves, because this is the moment when Amy is breaking into America. Interestingly, because what we used to have the version of that song that had Jay-Z on it. Jay-Z, even though the song itself is written by Amy Winehouse, and the EMI owned the publishing, and Universal Music owned the actual record itself, Jay-Z owns a part of that music, and he didn't want us to use that particular version. So we kind of, he owned a part of that song, his own lyrics which he put into it, which meant we had to deal with him, and he didn't want to deal with us on that. So he took that off, and we had to use another track. All of the other footage that's going there, you've got magazine covers. Now we use some quotations in there. You could probably get away with that with quotation law, but also typeface and how everything is laid out, that's another copyright. You're dealing with the personality rights of, if you want to get some footage out of David Letterman's company, Worldwide Pants, you've got to pay for David Letterman himself as well. The Jay Leno show, that's a union show. So we had to go through the Directors Guild. The Directors Guild wanted some money for that as well as getting the NBC Universal would not even consider selling us that clip unless Jay Leno himself was happy for us to have done that. So the loophole, the amount of kind of hoops you have to jump through to get something done is quite intense, which is why then people start thinking about fair use for things like this. But at the same time, if you actually go down and you are prepared to clear all those, you can create something like that. And to me, that's where archive really works. So these kind of layers of archive, of authenticity, bringing stuff into it. It seems really complicated, and it is. But setting up a shoot to try to do that in real life would be just as complicated and just as expensive. And an awful lot of that copyright, that material in there was free or virtually didn't cost us much at all.
Can I ask, you said, did you clear every single element in that shot, or did you say that you didn't?
No, we
I
cleared
thought you
everything.
said- okay.
Yeah, so we even went back and cleared, Directors Guild. The Directors Guild of America and SAG and all these, they are collective bargaining agreements which are set up in another country. It was a UK film, so we didn't really have to do that, but they were kicking up a fuss still. So rather than, this is the interesting thing. It's like, not to put the libraries on the spot. When you go to a library and they'll sell you a piece of footage or a piece of audio, even if they're saying that they own it, not just they own their copy, you really do need to check the license, because they're often selling you something which they're saying, well, actually, we'll sell you this, and here's a license to clear it in these territories, but we're not going to say that we clear anything in it. It's like going to a coffee shop and going, okay, I want a cup of coffee, and they bring it back and go, well, here's your cup of coffee. We can't guarantee it's coffee, and we can't guarantee that we own it, but we do own the cup. And so, that you have to be aware of that, which is why on that film, we rewrote every contract to make sure that we're covered, because we've then got to pass that on to.
I wouldn't disagree with what you say.
Yeah.
The archive can only do so much. There will be an element where you have to double check, particularly with your lawyers, and that's for the reason why I said at the beginning, is because copyright is an ever-changing, ever multiplying. And it's very difficult for the archive to do all its work and keep up with the copyright situation. We'll advise you as much as we're able, but ultimately.
She will advise, and it's like, ask. Okay, are all the people in this cleared? Who,
and Tony needs to earn a living, obviously, as well.
Well, we've had the classic here. I'm dying to say this, actually.
Say it.
We had a client that in the early days of Take That who decided to make a documentary about Take That. And they were very, very clever about using fair use for criticism or review, which you've been trying to get me not to talk about. And it's kind of a bit of a fine balance, particularly with the sort of work that Paul does, where it doesn't really work. But what they did is...
We did fair use in Amy.
Yeah, well, a lot of it could have been, because it's you can use criticism or review. You can use another person's copyright for criticism or review, and it's a bit of a subject. But what they did was, with this Take That, they went around all the newsreels and news stations and ITV and whatever, and they got a whole load of footage of interviews, and then they got sound-alike music, and it was one of these sort of cheap VHSs that went out in the days of VHS. But of course, every single archive would say, you can use the footage, but it's not cleared for anything you want to use it for. So in other words, it was very, very clear, which is a shortened version of what you were doing. But what was interesting is they managed to get clearance to use the interviews. But in one of the interviews, the 4 guys, or 5 I think there were at that point before Robbie left, stood up and broke into an impromptu 20-second performance of one of their hits of the time. And of course, as soon as they do that, there's an original performance where you've got to get a performer's right clearance, but they're also singing an original composition, which straight away you've got to look at who is the writer, and I think it was a Gary Barlow composition, so they needed to get a clearance from him and a clearance from the publisher of the song. So that's the kind of practical end of what you end up having to deal with.
Music is, it's a whole different panel, really, because it's
a nightmare.
And
So remember when we said it was a simple concept?
I do some music clearance, but I will always use an expert music person, generally because you need those connections, personal connections within publishing houses and so on that they will have. But again, you can get away, because it happens, trust me, where people use footage without paying for it. You cannot do that with music.
There's a great example of this. Some of you may remember a film from about 1990-something called Titanic. How many people have seen Titanic? Yeah. Well, you'll remember that as the ship goes down, there's a little dance orchestra playing, and then they walk onto the deck and they're playing songs. At the time, my firm used to work with 20th Century Fox Music. And a week before the premiere of this movie that allegedly cost 200 million quid, I got a phone call from the lawyer in Los Angeles saying, we've got these songs, and what they've done is someone had a copy of the Titanic band book from 1912, and it had in that book 50 or 60 pieces of music that were performed by the band on the Titanic during the course of the voyage. And he said, well, we need to clear these songs. We've re-recorded them, but we're not sure if they're in copyright. And they were all songs first published in England in or about 1905, 1910, 1912. And he said, we don't know if they're in copyright or not. So, well, send them over, let me find out. And talking about specialists, there used to be a guy in Soho who used to cycle around in a tweed suit. I can't for the life of me remember his name, but you might remember him. It was about 18, 20 years ago. And his specialist subject was English music copyrights between 1890 and 1925.
That's mastermind subject.
Some of these, the thing, as soon as I saw it, well, hang on a sec, this publishing company is now part of Warner Chappell. And they said, well, we asked them, and I said, it's definitely theirs. Just because they don't know they've got it, it's theirs. I know that.
Yeah.
But this guy was able to give the history of each of these composers. And of course, if the music, the copyright expires 70 years after the death of the composer. And one of these 5 songs, the guy had died in sort of November 1927, so he was still in copyright by about 2 months. And this chap didn't have, faxes or anything. And the following day, he gave me a handwritten summary of the names of the song, who the writers were, when they died, and the history of the publishing, because he knew. And we were able to deliver that to Fox, who were then able to find the right people to clear it. But you're completely
Paul
right.
mentioned about these companies the clearance companies, and I think Paul's absolutely right that you should consider hiring their services because they will make the whole complicated.
With music, it's a no-brainer. The amount of money it will save you, because they will be able to negotiate rates that you just cannot negotiate.
They'll save you money. They'll save you money on your fees, and they'll save your money on your hair going grey overnight as well.
And remember, and this is really, really important, that when you clear a piece of recorded music, there are 3 rights you need to know you have. The underlying composition, the performer, and the sound recording. Usually the performer and the sound recording will go together, but the number of times where I've had filmmakers come to me and said, oh, well, we went to EMI and we paid them, £5,000 for this recording. And I'd say, well, yeah, but you haven't cleared the underlying musical material. So it's an easy trap into which you might fall.
Or a lucrative business for struggling documentary filmmakers.
Can I just make one more point about the Amy clip? It starts in Washington Square, and if you film anything in front of the Hollywood sign or the Eiffel Tower, I don't know how, you start getting into location rights as well. and because people will try and
Trademarking.
and so there it's not just there's every element of archive film can have a copyright attached to it. Yeah, that is getting quite scary now, but it's
And slightly off the archive thing,
Yeah.
we had a client about 2 years ago that was making a feature film about things that had happened in Glasgow with a notorious Glaswegian who was a bit of a ne'er-do-well. And they applied for permission to shoot some establishment shots on the streets of Glasgow and were refused.
Really? That's very unusual these days.
If you knew what the film was, I can't say
Yeah.
you'd understand.
Which brings us into a sort of a whole different rights issue, if you like, and that's the rights in terms of ethics, isn't
Yeah.
it? You know, that can be a sort of moral right, I suppose, is probably the best way to put it.
Yeah.
But
I'm
we
aware
probably
that we're
don't wanna
running
go
out.
there, do
Well,
we?
no, I'm aware we're running out of time, but I do think it's worth bringing the point up and asking you the question: how do you consider yourself? Where do you find the line as a custodian of material when somebody comes to you and says, "I'm willing to pay for this. I want this material"? Do you take a line on finding out what it is they want to do with it, or do you just hand it over?
Yeah, if we can, but you'd be amazed. I mean, I think as filmmakers, you know what this feels like. Filmmakers get very, very protective of their ideas, and quite often it's difficult to find out a huge amount of detail about the project because of that. I want to keep this idea. Lots of filmmakers are so scared that somebody else has got the same idea as they do. But we always reassure the people that work with us that we are absolutely, we will guard your confidentiality as our own. So from that point of view, you don't need to worry. But in terms of donors, people have actually given us footage that we license on their behalf. We feel a considerable responsibility to look after their material and to some extent be able to govern how it's used. But that is really difficult. It is really very much down to the filmmaker being honest with us in the first place. And sometimes that doesn't happen. We have had 1 or 2 occasions where filmmakers have deliberately misled us into how the production is going to pan out because they're worried that we won't let them have the footage otherwise, in which case you're really in difficult water. The whole relationship between filmmaker and archive should be one where we can help each other and get the best that we can in that way. And certainly our donors depend upon us as being that custodian, and that extends to making sure that their material is used in the best possible way.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, don't be afraid to ask these questions as a filmmaker. If you're looking to donate your work, do some research, have a conversation with the
Yeah.
people that you're speaking to.
Yeah, I mean, some of our donors, for example, simply blanket do not want their material to be used in particular contexts. We have 1 or 2 collections where we are not allowed it to be used in a pop promo. We're not allowed it to be used in an advertisement. We're not allowed it to be used in a particular political... I mean, we've got collections from lifelong communists, for example, who absolutely refuse that their work, for really understandable reasons, should ever be used in any other context except for with a left-wing agenda. And, you know, their huge fear is that perhaps they will see their material licensed to go into, say, a conservative party political broadcast or something of that sort. So you do find those kinds of restrictions on how you can supply material, and we take those restrictions very seriously.
I would just jump in and echo all that, but sort of from the programming angle, and I think this is where, you know, as a curator, and if you're presenting material to the public and selecting material, this is where context comes in, and context is so important. And if you are sort of curating or selecting material that's of a sensitive nature for whatever reason, this is why just kind of dumping stuff online is just not, from my point of view, not an option. I think it's very, very important that you're putting it in the correct context. So, you know, material does come up where even if you have the necessary clearances, you want to make sure that people understand the context in which it was.
You kind of protect people even though they're not asking to be protected to some extent,
yeah.
Which sounds...
without necessarily
Without,
sort of
oh gosh,
being
yes,
the censor or
yeah.
the, you know, the sort of moral arbiter of what
Oh, I
should
think
be
I think
made
that's a
available.
really important
Yeah.
point. Of course, we know, as we said at the beginners, I'm just a librarian. I don't see myself as part of the creative process at all, and I certainly wouldn't want to. I mean, an example that I give is a collection came to me, and it was the 1920s, and it was about a mental institution, and it had people in straitjackets and in padded cells and stuff, and I stressed quite a lot, even though the donor actually didn't seem to be that bothered, because donors sometimes lose touch with those particular family members, and they didn't seem to be terribly concerned. But I was very concerned that those people were identifiable and might be identified by somebody who would be really upset to see their material being used in that context. So almost sometimes you have to sort of protect donors and point these things out to them.
I mean, medical, footage and medical-related collections can be particularly tricky, and for instance, the IWM will often use as an example in this case those sort of footage of shell-shocked soldiers in the First World War and all those issues of identifying people that were in a particularly vulnerable situation when they were filmed, and about consent.
I feel that, we need to bring Paul
the
in.
other side of that being, of course, that everyone has a right to privacy, but at the same time, we as filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, have a right to question, and we have a right to investigate. Even if it's, I'm often kind of run into problems of access just for investigation, not for broadcast, not for transmission in any way. And being a librarian is one thing. When it starts becoming, okay, I'm now policing this, then that's something else. So and I'm not saying that it happens with the BFI or with Huntley, but I've certainly run into it in many occasions where, institutions who really should know better because they have investigative research teams themselves with their own programs, they're stopping me from getting access to material because they feel that, it would be insensitive for me to do that. Well, I need to be able to have some input into that as well as a documentary filmmaker, and go the other way. It's like, there's a brilliant editor I work with who just says, Paul, we're making art, so I'm allowed access to anything. So it's, which isn't entirely true. But we do need to be able to get access to material. Sometimes that means we actually have to get access to material that people don't want us to get access to, which is where, as much as we're talking about copyright and all of the copyrights that were involved in the clip I just showed you from Amy, for all of them there are exceptions. There are all ways that freedom of expression, freedom to investigate, freedom of speech, etc., can be applied to use material in a way that is useful and is not necessarily just there because you can't afford to pay for the copyright.
I think this is where the whole thing of cultivating that relationship between researchers and archives, and that sense of trust between the two, and that's where that becomes so important, and for anyone that is wanting to get into.
Well, that's why we love archive producers, because archive producers are usually quite well trained and quite well experienced in all these issues, and it just makes the whole process so much easier when you're dealing with somebody who, I think there's less of a trend now, but there used to be a massive trend that the runner would do the archive research.
It does,
and that would be a really difficult. And I'd have conversations with people, and they'd say, I want footage, I want to do the Second World War in 30 seconds. And I'd say, well, what do you want to particularly highlight? And then you'd hear the runner shouting across to somebody else in the office, what do you want to particularly highlight? And thinking, this is really...
It's been a historically undervalued profession, and I think that is changing. I mean, Paul would know more.
I think it's changing. I think it is. I hope we've been through the bad days,
I don't think we would want to be seen as the sort of mean gatekeepers that are restricting access.
I think if you have...
We're all negotiating that.
It's not our job, as Paul says, it's not our job.
Yeah, different collections work in different ways, and it's like, you do hope that as an archive producer, you get trusted to actually do. If you say to a director, well, you can't have it, of course they want it. So, it's a classic thing. It's like, it's just psychology. Well, give me access with like time code all over it or something like. Let me do the negotiations internally, and then if it's going to used in a way that shouldn't be used, then I'm more likely the person who's actually. I need some kind of say into that, as opposed to a firewall to begin with. Because it just doesn't work that way, kind of people,
and I think
will get hold of the material in some way.
On the plus side, people are more and more interested in becoming archive producers, and specifically taking an interest in archive. There are students out there who are taking, and I'm always amazed and find it fantastic that there is this desire amongst young people to learn and understand this craft.
Well, I think this is a really good point to actually hear from some people in the room who I'm sure actually have questions for us, because we could talk for hours, as is clear. Gentleman at the front here.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to quote 3 examples as questions of maybe things which haven't been dealt with yet, and stop me if they have. The film shown this morning from the BFI archive, made in 1930. I'm particularly interested in this because I'm making a film about housing, and it features the Silchester estate, which is there's a current campaign about, which I'm covering.
This is Kensington Calling.
Yeah. So we don't know who the filmmakers are, apparently, but somebody owns the copyright. So all my questions relate to kind of copyright scams or scoop-ups, and how to get around those. That's my first. The second one is an example from a film I made for Channel 4, where we went to a Soho archive and they were happy to lease us the footage for a substantial sum. And our distributor actually said who had a lot of experience of this, said, well, you'll be able to get this for free from somewhere else. And it was a US government thing made publicly available, and therefore, and actually they didn't have any copyright, clearance for this, as it turned out. So that was another scam, if you like. I mean, archive is a business and a respectable business, and I do strongly respect your work, but I'm just talking about the bad examples we can come across as producers. And then from the other side, as a producer, as we're all producing archive all the time, a friend of mine yesterday in the video activism meeting, his footage was used by the BBC because it was on YouTube, which is clear, to me, that's the legal case there is clearly nonsense. Everything on YouTube is copyright. Creative Commons is a copyright license. He puts his stuff out Creative Commons, as so do I. It's a copyright license. It's not free for the BBC to use. And they sent him a letter, which is interesting about this, about how bad things are getting. They sent him a letter which said, we've taken it down. It's been on the national news. We've taken it down off the website. If you and we used it in the public interest, which, as far as I can see, is not a justification for using copyright footage without paying for it. If you like, you can say that we stole it. And they put this in a letter. So anyway, that's my third example.
So can I summarise what I think are the 3 questions?
Yes, please.
Yes. The first one was, how do you make sure you don't get caught up by copyright scammers and people pretending that they own material when they don't? What was the second?
There was public domain footage you were talking about from
And something
Soho
about
archive.
Kensington.
Yeah, what was the one to do with Kensington Calling? What was your complaint about that the BFI don't own the copyright, or?
Tony quoted this example where you have to sign over your copyright. So one thing is 1930, so he didn't. I don't know what the law was.
You're looking at the 1911 Act, which was overtaken in 1956, and about once a year we have to look at the 1911 Act.
I look at it a lot more from the map.
The answer is that you can't generalise about films from 1930. Some of them might still be in copyright, and some of them might not. You've really got to look at who made it, who was the writer, who was the director, is the studio still around, who was the producer, etc., and you have to analyse each film and consider whether or not it is in copyright or not. The big copyright scams you have to be careful of, and in fact, is there are lots and lots of films that's a generalisation, public domain in America, because their registration rules are very complicated and far too complex for this, and they may well be public domain in the US, but because they are public domain in the US doesn't make them
There's no public domain
in Europe, where we've got different rules. So the same film can be in copyright in one place and out of copyright the other, which
I mean, I would just
picks up Paul's point.
to
But
pick
if
it.
you're doing something that's got potentially a global audience in various media, you've got to make sure that you cover everything.
I mean, then talking about public domain, so the one from the Soho archive, which you found out that was, might have been shot by the Department of Defence or something like that. Every film library, as far as I'm aware, will have some form of public domain material in there. I don't necessarily as a scam that they're reselling it on. It's because have you ever been to the National Archives in Washington? To actually get access to this material, to get it to your point of sale, you have to invest an awful lot of time and money. So, I'm no arch capitalist, but there is a return on investment to be had there, and you are, and also from someone who makes films from archive, I often want to be able to go to the National Archives and do the research myself. Oftentimes, I'm working on a quick turnaround for Channel 4 and I need it now. Yeah. So I need someone
They're offering
like
you
Huntley
that
Archives
service.
who can do that.
They're offering you a service.
Yeah, so there are two levels of things going on there. When it comes down to the video activism, so I'm assuming this was shown on the news. So if it was shown on the news, it may well be that it's, when someone dies, who died recently, Prince, it's like they're showing copyright material. They're not paying for that material. It's newsworthy. So I think news agencies have to have the ability to report the news.
They have a 24-hour window.
Copyright Act,
so it's
current affairs.
they're not stealing it by doing that.
They get 24 hours, don't they? They get 24 hours from the first publication.
I think that's convention rather than legal.
It's become, and so, but to actually, I used to I've worked for BBC News, I've worked for Sky News for a little bit, I've worked for other, news agencies where there are conventions that allow news to arrive onto your television screen or onto your radio. And without those conventions and people kind of working together and being flexible about things like copyright and sending 5 camera people into a war zone when really you only need 1 and you have pool footage. There are things like that, and those conventions have generally grown up for good reasons. And I would, I want a news media which can report on events without being hamstrung by draconian copyright laws.
The easiest example is, for example, if Sky TV, Sky Sports has the exclusive on the Premier League or whatever it is, ITV News might report that Chelsea beat Leicester 3-0 or whatever it was, and you'll see maybe a 10-second clip of somebody scoring a goal or whatever, and in the corner it'll have from Sky TV or whatever it is. So as part of that fair use, you're crediting the underlying ownership of the copyright, but you're using that footage, which is exclusively the property of Sky, for the purpose of reporting a current event, i.e. that Chelsea beat Leicester or whoever it was. Sorry, football fans, I got that wrong. I know Leicester did beat Chelsea.
But I think it's worth making a point as well that copyright law, I believe, personally, didn't evolve to lock material away from people. No. It's evolved so that material is given a value and therefore has a set of rules that enables it to be shared and enables it to be preserved. Sometimes the law could move forward a bit faster than you want it to. Yeah. Sometimes it could be simpler.
I'd like to just put the other side of that, because I look after creative people, and the copyrights they create are their legacy. And I always remember once, many years ago, I had a fairly now obscure singer-composer who had a couple of hits, and he came to see me, and he had various offers of publishing from publishers who are willing to pay quite a bit of money to him. And he said, well, what happens when I die? And I said, well, the copyright will last for another 50, as it was 50 years then, before it shows you how long I've been practicing, 70 years now. And your family will enjoy the benefit. You can write a will, and your children and grandchildren. So he said, well, what about after the 50 years? I said, well, at that point, it becomes public domain. He said, what do you mean? I've written this. This is my baby. What do you mean my family won't own it anymore? So that's the other.
Yeah, isn't that just the human condition, though? You know, I don't want to have to pay copyright, but on the other hand, I don't want anybody to infringe mine. I mean, that's just life, isn't it? We all go through that.
Can we move on and see if there's any other questions? Oh, lots of questions. Okay, let's take you at the front.
I'm really interested in how do you find archive material to use while you're cutting your film before you know what you'll end up using at the end?
Well, you don't, I guess. It's like you know, it's archive for the way I make archive films and the people that I work with and the way we make them collaboratively. And that also includes the archives themselves. Amy had its world premiere at Cannes, and I was lucky enough to go to Cannes and be on the red carpet. My overriding memory of Cannes is the smell of diesel, actually. It's not the nicest place to go and have a film festival. I made sure, and I did this on Senna, I did it on Amy, we actually had it at the BFI both times. We have a screening for all the people who put archive into the film, because you can't make the film without them. And that goes out throughout the process. So we don't work with a script. So, you know, I start looking for material to do with Amy Winehouse. There's quite a lot of it out there. Interestingly, from a research point of view, it really helps if you've got a name like Winehouse, because it's a visual archive, but it only works through a word search to get into it. So if you're doing a film on The Who, good luck.
Yeah.
So there's a whole other side of, you need people to really catalogue this stuff for you. So public domain material which has come out, for it to be searchable, someone's got to watch it and log it, and all that needs to be paid for.
What I mean also
very
is, do you have to pay
time-consuming,
for it all in
labour-intensive.
advance before
Oh, no,
you...
no. It's the way, I mean, it's classic. It's a thing of access. If you're a documentary filmmaker, there's this word access. What access have you got to this? Well, most archives it's in their benefit to give you access up front, so you can get in. So it's like, no one charges you to go into a shop and to window shop, you know, and take photos of it and to, you know, compare it and do whatever. It's like, you know, it's interesting. I think it's on Amazon. You know, there's the actual thumbnails for the books. I don't think there's any copyright on those, because they're not paying to show images like that, because you couldn't shop otherwise.
Having published the book on Amazon, I can tell you the answer to that. You sign a thing that basically gives them the right to put everything up there and a given number of sample chapters, so you can get the first 5 chapters for free.
So the whole point being that it's access. So you get access in there, and the classic ways that you would go to, if you go to Huntley, they have a YouTube channel now, I think, and it's like, so it will be time coded. It will have watermarks on it. So if you want to use it when you finally come to online your film, you go through this whole process, which is another complicated process. You put the jigsaw back together, and you put it back together with all the master material. And that's when you really do need an archive producer. Because if you reach that point and you don't know where all of that stuff comes from, then you're in crap. You really are. And it's a very expensive... I mean, and I know countless numbers of films which have just never come out because they've reached that point in the film and they can't ever go beyond it, because it's too much time and effort to unpick where everything has come from.
I'm conscious that we are running out of time, but I saw 2 hands previously. So perhaps we'll take these 2 questions on this side of the room, answer them, and then I saw 2 hands over here, and then we'll have to stop.
Just a quick question about WikiLeaks, or Wikipedia. I don't know why.
Same thing.
Tell me about the availability of those images. I've heard that they're available, and then I've heard that they're not. Do we know?
There is Creative Commons that you have to... I mean, every photo on Wikipedia, as far as I'm aware, if you go into it, it will detail the Creative Commons license that is on there.
Okay,
I don't think they'll have anything on there which isn't covered by Creative Commons.
But are you asking, can you use it because it's up there? And the answer is, I don't think so. I think you have to clear it.
It depends.
It's out of copyright.
Creative Commons is not one license. There are different types of Creative Commons. If you go on, a good way of understanding that, if you use Flickr, if you go onto Flickr, they'll, it's like, some people are happy for you to use their photograph as long as you give them a credit. Some people will need some payment for it. Some people will want, and they will put restrictions on it. As Amanda was saying before, it's like, this is owned by someone else, they can put restrictions in place.
Flickr, right.
But yet, there is no such thing, even though many archives try and tell you that there's a one-stop shop. There isn't. You can't just go to something and use something without doing any form of investigation into it yourself.
Yeah,
you have a
investigation is the
responsibility
key.
to do that.
You need to be able to prove that you've done the research. I think there was a gentleman behind you that had a question.
I have a question for you, Paul. I was wondering, in terms of copyright, what is the greatest challenge you have faced?
Oh, God.
Sorry.
It's...
We already talked about music. I think
Yeah,
I'd put that
music,
high on the list.
I would say music is, it's a collective thing, actually. You face, to make a film like Amy, you are faced with every form of copyright kind of challenge that you have. The hardest, actually, well, as an archive producer, I'd say the most difficult is managing the expectations of the people that you're working with. Because if you work with producers and directors who don't really understand archive, they start imagining archive. They start imagining that it exists. And there's a very famous example of Khrushchev banging his shoe on the table at the United Nations, which happened, but there's no film of it. There's film of him banging his hand and maybe his elbow or something else, but you add the two things together and you think that there's footage there that doesn't exist. And so when you're creating a film, and if it's one of those films where you're trying to put archive in, as opposed to it being driven by the archive, so that you've got your story and you're trying to fit, and you end up with normally trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, because the archive that they really want and is in their script may never exist. There was a series called Reporters at War, which I did for Discovery Europe in 2004, and it was such a learning curve for me. I was working with John Blair, who is a brilliant Oscar-winning filmmaker. The series was kind of a landmark series for Discovery Europe. If people are old enough to remember the Cold War and the World at War, they wanted something similar to that. So we interviewed Walter Cronkite, got all the people who were war reporters throughout the 20th century, going into the 21st. And
Yeah, we have a
we
red
need
light
we
flashing
needed
at us.
we needed to find a piece of footage of an empty village with chickens running through it in Vietnam, because that's what the guy said, and it took me forever to find that.
I think people mix up in their own mind what they've seen on a feature film and think that it exists as documentary, and people mix up what they think they've seen on as a still, and they think they've seen it as moving. So there's all sorts of...
If you let go, and actually this is, I think, where, interestingly, with documentary, and perhaps Senna and Amy have had some input into this, actually trusting the archive itself to tell the story, as opposed, because then it becomes story showing, not storytelling. And, I went into this village in Vietnam and there were some chickens running around. Well, you just told me that. You want some big illustrative point.
I'm
to
going to
go
cut
on
you
there.
off because we have a red light flashing, and I know there were two more questions that I would like to at least have a go at answering. So the lady in the middle and then the gentleman, if you both ask your questions and then we'll respond.
I was just wondering, at what stage do you start clearing your archive footage? So would you do it after the final edit? Yeah.
No, I normally, it obviously depends on the production. If it's a very quick turnaround thing, I will not give anything to the editor that isn't already, I know that I can clear. I know that it's within the budget. If it's a film like Amy, I don't worry too much about it at the beginning, which I know some people are aghast at, but I don't, because I know that we'll solve those problems as we go along. But I always do something called a preview picture lock at various points during the film, even if it's only, I know it's going to change maybe 80%. I'll get the edit to give me what's called an EDL, which gives me it looks like the Matrix. It's where everything comes from. And I say this to all my students, if you make films, you eventually make spreadsheets. That's what you do.
If you do anything, eventually you make spreadsheets.
And then you have a gas
advice.
bill, and then life is terrible.
Yeah.
And so I always tend to have a preview picture lock where I can take a snapshot of where we're at in the film, and we'll know where things are from and what they cost.
Okay.
Which
I'm
I
cutting you
open.
off again.
Yeah.
I'm so aware of the red light. It really works. Yeah, it's just, we're going to explode. So.
I'll try and be quick. So if you've got a photograph, say, or another work, leaving music aside, that you really want to use, but you simply cannot find, however hard you try, the copyright owner, what do you do as a practical matter, and can you rely on insurance from the point of view of international distribution?
Best endeavours is read Tony's
Orphan
book.
works.
Actually,
From a practical point of view.
Without boring, the cover picture on my book, I particularly wanted to use, and I found it online, and I tracked down the archive that kept it. And they gave me a license to use it, but couldn't guarantee that it was in or out of copyright. And it's a still from a shoot on a film. And actually, we were discussing it earlier. It is probably out of copyright.
The film definitely is.
The film is.
But we had a
what I
discussion
did on the
around
cover
whether-
is I used criticism and review and did a whole spiel about the photograph, which is a bit of a cheat because I haven't really used it for criticism and
But
review.
you're a lawyer, who's going to argue?
There are, I
have a
mean,
reasoned
within
case.
copyright law themselves, there are ways of doing, whether it's an orphan works or if you know that. So sorry, go ahead.
I'm just saying, what are those ways? I mean, I know there's an orphan works licensing scheme in the UK, but that only covers the UK. So if you want to distribute internationally,
There are some. Archive is a grey area, and there will always. You have got a distributor at some point has got to take a commercial risk on something, that.
Back to risk assessment.
Yeah, it comes down to even if you're shooting a feature film where you own every element in front of there may well be something that you've overlooked. That is why you have errors and omissions, insurance, why you have a whole raft of other kind of issues around there. But with archive, you cannot. I mean, the lovely trailer from the BFI, there were people in there. They've got no release forms for them. Whatever happens if kind of one of them might be still alive and go, "How dare you show me in your film?"
So
you
due
have
diligence,
to-
research, and eventually
and
risk.
assessment.
Yeah.
Life does. You don't. To be.
and E&O insurance.
Then
and
it comes
E&O
down to good
is
insurance.
important. Yeah, but that doesn't cover everything, and there are lots of different types of it. So
You have to be pragmatic as well
Yeah.
as diligent. I mean, otherwise you
yeah,
won't.
and it goes back to managing the expectations, not just of the people you're working with, but the people who will buy your film. Michael Moore wouldn't have made a film if no one took a risk on where that archive came from.
I think that is a very good place to end, and possibly no one would make a film if nobody was willing to take risks in general, and we're all in the business of film. So thank you very much to my panelists. I think you were fantastic, and thanks, guys, for your questions and your time.